I stared at the email in disbelief, my trembling fingers hovering over my keyboard. The subject line read, "Application for mailroom position," and the name attached made my heart skip. Michael Jensen, my older brother. The same brother who had laughed in my face 3 years ago when I told my family I was leaving my corporate job to start an online vintage clothing business. "You're throwing away your MBA for a glorified garage sale?" he sneered across our parents' dinner table. Yet here he was, 5 years later, applying to work for the company he had once dismissed as a naive pipe dream. This wasn't just an employment application. It was the final chapter in a story of sibling rivalry that had shaped my entire life. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I remember exactly where I was when I made the decision to quit my finance job. The 57th floor of the Morgan Stanley building in downtown Chicago, staring out at Lake Michigan from the corner office I had fought so hard to earn. I should have felt accomplished, perhaps even triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. My name is Olivia Jensen. At 32, I had checked every box on the successful career woman checklist. Prestigious business school, 6-figure salary, corner office, with a view. But that Tuesday afternoon in November, watching the gray waves crash against the shoreline, I realized I hadn't drawn a genuinely happy breath in years. The vintage Dior scarf knotted at my neck, a lucky find at a Paris flea market during a rare vacation, felt like the only authentic piece of me in that sterile glass office. My passion for vintage clothing had been my secret escape since college. While my peers spent weekends at networking events, I hunted through estate sales and forgotten boutiques, building a collection that told stories of different eras and the women who had lived in them. Quarterly projections are due tomorrow. "Olivia," my boss said, dropping another stack of papers on my already crowded desk. "The board meeting's been moved up." I nodded mechanically, but something had shifted inside me. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. building a business plan for what would eventually become Reclaimed Threads, an online boutique specializing in curated vintage clothing with modern styling guidance. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting at my parents' expansive dining table in Evanston, surrounded by the familiar tensions and expectations that had shaped my childhood. My father, Richard Jensen, retired surgeon and perpetual skeptic, sat at the head of the table. My mother, Eleanor, ever the peacekeeper, nervously passed serving dishes. And then there was Michael, my older brother by 4 years, whose achievements had always been the measuring stick against which mine were judged. "I've decided to leave Morgan Stanley," I announced after the obligatory small talk had run its course. "I'm starting my own business." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgment, but it was Michael who broke it with a short, dismissive laugh. "You're joking, right?" he said, setting down his wine glass with more force than necessary. "You're giving up a director track position to sell clothes online?" "It's more than just selling clothes," I countered, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's creating a curated marketplace for sustainable fashion. Vintage pieces with history and quality craftsmanship, styled for modern consumers who are tired of fast fashion." My father frowned. "Olivia, you're throwing away years of education and career building. For what? A glorified garage sale?" The echo of Michael's earlier sentiment wasn't lost on me. They'd always been aligned against me, father and son, cut from the same practical, risk-averse cloth. "Your father has a point," my mother added gently. "Couldn't you do this as a hobby while keeping your job?" I took a measured breath. "I've done the market research. There's a growing demographic of consumers looking for sustainable, unique fashion with history. I've already built a prototype website and secured relationships with key estate liquidation companies." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of pity and condescension. "Oh, she's done market research," he mocked, making air quotes. "Liv, this isn't like you. You've always been the sensible one." Maybe that's the problem, I replied, meeting his gaze. I've always done what was expected. Harvard Business School because Dad went there. Finance because it was practical. I've spent my entire life following a path that was laid out for me. A path that's made you very successful, my father interjected. Financially successful, I corrected. But I'm not happy. Michael rolled his eyes. Happiness doesn't pay the mortgage. Actually, my mortgage is already paid off, I said quietly. I've been living well below my means and saving for this opportunity. That silenced him momentarily, but he wasn't finished. You're having some kind of early midlife crisis. This business will fail within a year, and then you'll be crawling back to your old firm if they'll even take you. His words stung, not just because of their harshness, but because they tapped into my deepest fears. What if he was right? What if I was throwing everything away for a fantasy? Michael, my mother admonished half-heartedly. No, Mom, she needs to hear this, he insisted. Olivia, you've always been smart, but this is naive. You're not an entrepreneur. You're a numbers person, an analyst. You don't have what it takes to build something from scratch. I felt something shift inside me then. A hardening. A resolve. Crystallizing where uncertainty had been. Michael had always been the golden child, the risk-taker who mysteriously never faced consequences for his failures. His startup had been funded by our father's connections. His MBA had been celebrated, with a new car. Meanwhile, my identical achievements had been met with nods and comments about how I was finally catching up to my brother. I guess we'll see, I said, placing my napkin beside my barely touched plate and standing up. I appreciate your concern, but my decision is made. I'm launching Reclaimed Threads next month. As I walked out of my parents' house that night, Michael followed me to my car. I thought for a moment he might offer an olive branch, some word of genuine support. Instead, he leaned against my car door, blocking my escape. You know what your problem is, Liv. You've always been jealous of my success. This little rebellion of yours isn't about vintage clothes or happiness. It's about trying to prove you can do something I haven't already done better. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, for the first time in years. His expensive suit couldn't hide the slight paunch forming at his waistline. His rehearsed confidence couldn't mask the faint scent of whiskey on his breath at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. No, Michael, I replied quietly. My problem is that I've spent too long caring what you think of me. That ends tonight. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The drive back to my loft apartment in Wicker Park was a blur of city lights and quiet tears. Michael's words echoed in my head, each syllable laced with the same dismissive tone he'd used throughout our lives. As I pulled into my parking space, I sat motionless for several minutes, letting the engine idle while I tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just about tonight's dinner. This was about a lifetime of Michael undermining me at every important juncture. When I was accepted to Harvard, Michael had somehow managed to redirect my parents' attention by announcing he was dating the daughter of a prominent senator. When I graduated with honors, Michael showed up late to the ceremony, drawing attention as he slid into his seat with a dramatic whisper apology about an important meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. When I received my first major promotion at Morgan Stanley, Michael coincidentally closed a significant acquisition deal the very same week, ensuring my achievement remained firmly in his shadow. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Zoe. How'd it go? Celebration drink at Harper's? I texted back, rain check, need to regroup. 3 dots appeared immediately. That's bad? I'm coming over. No arguments, bringing wine. 30 minutes later, Zoe was sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, pouring generous glasses of Cabernet while I paced back and forth, recounting the dinner disaster. And then he had the nerve, the absolute audacity, To suggest I was jealous of him. I finished, finally collapsing onto my sofa. Zoe, with her characteristic directness, didn't offer platitudes. Your brother's an ass. This isn't news, Liv. I wasn't wrong. Zoe had witnessed the Michael and Olivia dynamic for over a decade, since our undergraduate days at Northwestern. As my roommate, she'd seen how I'd reshape my achievements to make them less threatening to my brother, how I'd downplay my successes to maintain family peace. But here's my question, she continued, swirling her wine thoughtfully. Why do you still care what he thinks? You're one of the sharpest financial minds I know. Your vintage collection is museum-worthy. You've saved enough to launch this business without outside funding. So why does Michael's opinion still matter? I stared into my wine glass, watching the liquid catch the light from my industrial pendant lamps. It's not that simple. Actually, it is, Zoe countered. You've spent your whole life in reaction mode, Liv. Everything you do is either to please your family or to prove them wrong. When are you going to do something purely for yourself? Her words hit with the force of truth. Even this business, as passionate as I was about it, was partially fueled by a desire to prove my worth. The realization left me feeling hollow. I think about that day in 7th grade sometimes, I said quietly. Zoe tilted her head, waiting for me to continue. The science fair. I'd built that solar-powered filtration system, spent months on it, won first place. I remember the photos. You were beaming. What I never told anyone was what happened when we got home. I took a deep breath, the memory still sharp after all these years. Michael destroyed it, claimed it was an accident. He tripped and fell into the display. But I saw him do it deliberately. When I tried to tell our parents, he convinced them I was being petty and jealous because his soccer team had won a regional championship that same weekend. Zoe's expression darkened. Jesus, Liv. That was the first time I understood how it would always be. Michael ascending, me adjusting. My parents always believed his version of events. And that's why you became the sensible one, Zoe said, understanding dawning in her eyes. If you couldn't outshine him, you'd be the responsible counterpoint. To his risk-taking, I nodded. It was the only space left for me. Zoe set down her glass with deliberate care. Olivia Jensen, listen to me. Your brother has been living rent-free in your head for decades. It's time to evict him. She stood up and walked to my dining table where my laptop sat closed. Show me the business plan. For the next hour, I walked her through my vision for reclaimed threads. The curated collections, the sustainable focus, the stories behind each piece. The styling guidance that would help customers incorporate vintage pieces into contemporary wardrobes. As I spoke, I felt the weight of the dinner confrontation gradually lifting, replaced by the genuine enthusiasm I'd felt when first conceiving the business. This is brilliant, Zoe said finally. And you know what's not in this entire business? Plan? A single mention of Michael or what anyone in your family thinks. She was right. My business concept had been born from genuine passion, not sibling rivalry. So here's what we're going to do, Zoe continued, switching into the strategic mode that had made her a successful marketing executive. We're going to set a launch date. We're going to identify key milestones. And most importantly, we're going to establish some ground rules. Ground rules? Rule number 1. No more family discussions about the business until you have something concrete to show them. I nodded slowly. That's probably wise. Rule number 2. You don't measure your success against Michael's ever. Different businesses, different metrics. Agreed. Rule number 3, she said, her voice softening. You call me whenever you start hearing Michael's voice in your head telling you can't do this. To my surprise, tears welled up in my eyes. What if he's right, though? What if I'm not cut out for this? Zoe reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That's not the Michael in your head talking. That's your fear. And fear I can work with. Because fear, unlike your brother, can be reasoned with. She was right. The fear of failure was real, but it wasn't insurmountable. The fear of never trying, of spending the rest of my life wondering what if, that was far worse. I'm going to need help, I admitted. I know fashion and finance, but marketing, operations, tech, there's so much I don't know yet. And that, Zoe said with a smile, is exactly what separates you from your brother. You know what you don't know. Michael has never had that kind of self-awareness in his life. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I laughed. It was a small sound, but genuine. That night, after Zoe left, I sat at my window overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city twinkled with possibility. I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "Reclaimed Threads, 90-day launch plan." Underneath, I added a personal note. "This is for me, not to prove anything to anyone else." As I worked into the early hours of the morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Michael's voice was still there in the back of my mind, doubtful and dismissive, but it was fainter now, drowned out by the sound of my own fingers typing decisively on the keyboard, crafting a future entirely of my own design. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My apartment was littered with evidence of the night before, sticky notes plastered across my kitchen island, spreadsheets printed and annotated, my whiteboard filled with business milestones and targets. I'd worked until 3 a.m., fueled by determination, and maybe a little spite. As I made my morning espresso, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Your brother is concerned about you. Perhaps you should call him." Typical. Less than 12 hours after Michael had belittled my business concept, he was positioning himself as the concerned older brother, and my mother was enabling it. The old me would have called immediately, ready to reassure and placate. Today, I simply set my phone down without responding. Instead, I called Dina Morales, a former business school classmate who had left the corporate world to start her own successful PR firm. "Olivia Jensen," she answered warmly. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Please tell me you're finally leaving that soul-crushing finance job." "How did you know?" I laughed. "Because you're too creative to spend your life analyzing other people's business ideas instead of building your own." There was a pause. "Wait, are you serious? You're leaving Morgan Stanley?" 20 minutes later, I was giving Dina the full rundown of Reclaimed Threads over video chat. Unlike my family, she immediately grasped the vision. "The timing is perfect," she said, her PR instincts clearly engaged. "Sustainable fashion is exploding, and the vintage market is fragmented. No one's really established themselves as the premium curator in that space yet." "That's exactly what my market research showed," I said, relieved that someone finally understood. "But you'll need more than just a good concept," Dina cautioned. "You need a launch strategy that establishes your credibility immediately. Fashion is all about perception." I nodded, jotting notes. "I've been thinking about that. What if we launch with a limited capsule collection? Something that tells a cohesive story?" Dina's eyes lit up. "Like power pieces from female CEOs of the 1980s or Hollywood's golden age, behind the seams." "Exactly. We could include the provenance of each piece, the story behind it. And we pitch it as the intersection of fashion, history, and female empowerment," Dina continued. "Not just clothes, but artifacts with stories, curated by a financial analyst turned fashion entrepreneur." The enthusiasm in her voice was contagious. This wasn't the skepticism I'd faced from my family. This was someone who saw the potential. I did. "I'm putting together a team of advisors," I told her. "People with complementary skills who can help me navigate the areas where I'm less experienced. Would you consider being part of that?" "Absolutely," Dina replied without hesitation. "But on one condition, You let me handle your personal brand alongside the business brand. Your brother isn't the only Jensen with a compelling story to tell. I felt a flicker of discomfort. I'd prefer to keep the focus on the business, not on family dynamics. Dina's expression softened. Olivia, your journey from finance to fashion is compelling on its own merits. I'm not suggesting we leverage your relationship with Michael. I'm suggesting we don't hide your impressive background because you're afraid of being compared to him. Her insight was unnervingly accurate. How many times had I downplayed my achievements to avoid the inevitable comparisons to Michael? By the end of the call, we had the outline of a PR strategy and a list of key influencers in the sustainable fashion space to approach. Dina also promised to introduce me to a web developer who specialized in e-commerce platforms for independent designers. Next, I called Marcus Chen, a former Morgan Stanley colleague who had left to start a boutique operations consulting firm. I was wondering when you'd make the leap, he said after I explained my plans. You've been talking about vintage fashion for as long as I've known you. Was it that obvious? I asked, surprised. Your eyes only lit up when you were talking about your weekend finds, he laughed. So what do you need from me? Logistics? Supply chain? All of it, I admitted. I know how to source the pieces, but establishing systems for inventory management, shipping, returns, that's where I'm out of my depth. For the next hour, Marcus walked me through the operational considerations I'd need to address. Warehousing, options, inventory tracking software, shipping partners, quality control processes. It was overwhelming, but also energizing to break the massive challenge down into manageable components. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, most entrepreneurs I work with come in with grand visions but no financial discipline. You're the opposite. You've got the financial acumen, but need to give yourself permission to think bigger with the vision. What do you mean? You're approaching this very methodically, which is good, but don't let your analytical side completely override your intuition. The reason people will choose your curation over others isn't just because of efficient operations, it's because of your unique eye and perspective. His words stayed with me as I spent the afternoon transforming my spare bedroom into a temporary office. I cleared out the guest bed, replacing it with a large work table where I could photograph and measure garments. I installed industrial clothing racks along one wall and converted the closet into a shipping station with a small table for a label printer and packaging materials. As I worked, my phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from my parents and Michael. I glanced at the notifications without opening them. Your father is disappointed. This isn't like you. Just call us and we can discuss. Each one aimed at pulling me back into the familiar family dynamic where my decisions required their approval. Instead of responding, I texted Zoe, building my war room. Want to help? She arrived an hour later with Thai food and a bottle of champagne. For christening the headquarters of Reclaimed Threads, she explained. As we ate, I shared my conversations with Dina and Marcus. Zoe nodded approvingly. You're building a brain trust. Smart. I can't do this alone, I admitted. And I need people who believe it's possible. Speaking of which, Zoe said, pulling out her tablet, I've been thinking about your social media strategy. The fashion world runs on Instagram and TikTok now. We need to establish your visual identity immediately. Zoe's day job as a marketing director made her input invaluable. She showed me mood boards she'd started creating, using photos I'd previously shared of my vintage collection. The key is consistency, she explained. Every post should reinforce your brand values, sustainability, history, quality, and personal transformation. Personal transformation? The garments and the women who wear them, she clarified. Each piece has been transformed from forgotten to treasured, just like the women who buy them might be transforming their own image or entering a new phase of life. I stared at her, impressed. That's exactly it. That's why I love vintage pieces. They have past lives and future potential. Zoe smiled. See? You already have the passion and the narrative. Now we just need to make it visible to everyone else. By the end of the evening, we had outlined a 90-day launch plan with clear milestones: website development, initial inventory acquisition and photography, brand identity finalization, and a soft launch to a select group of influencers and potential customers. As Zoe was leaving, she paused at the door. "What are you going to tell them at Morgan Stanley?" I hadn't even considered it yet. I'd been so focused on the business launch that I hadn't thought about my resignation process. The truth, I decided. That I'm pursuing an entrepreneurial opportunity that aligns with my personal passion. And if they counteroffer? I didn't hesitate. No amount of money would make me stay now. After Zoe left, I stood in the center of my newly created workspace, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my dream taking shape. The clothing racks were still empty, waiting to be filled with carefully selected pieces. The photography area was set up but unused. The shipping station was pristine in its readiness. Everything was potential, waiting to be realized. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the unread messages from my family. Instead of responding to any of them individually, I sent a single group text. "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is made. I've spent the last 5 years researching this market alongside my finance career, and I'm well prepared for this transition. I won't be discussing the business further until after launch, when I'll be happy to show you what I've built. Love, Olivia." Then I turned off notifications from all of them, set my phone aside, and opened my laptop to draft my resignation letter. As I typed, I felt the weight of family expectations lifting. For the first time, I wasn't making a decision in reaction to Michael or in anticipation of my parents' judgment. I was charting a course based solely on my own vision and values. Whether Reclaimed Thread succeeded or failed, this moment, this feeling of alignment with my true self, was already a victory. The battle with Michael's dismissal of my business wasn't going to be won through argument or persuasion. It would be won through methodical execution and tangible results. I didn't need to convince anyone with words. I would let my actions speak instead. 2 weeks later, I stood in the middle of a small warehouse space in Westtown, keys in hand, still somewhat in disbelief. What had once been a printing company's storage facility was now the official headquarters of Reclaimed Threads. The space wasn't glamorous. Concrete floors, exposed brick walls, utilitarian lighting. But it was mine, secured with a favorable 1-year lease thanks to a connection from Marcus. "So this is really happening," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Zoe wheeling in a clothing rack draped with garment bags. "This is really happening," I confirmed, unable to keep the mix of excitement and terror from my voice. My last day at Morgan Stanley had been surreal. After 5 years of 60-hour weeks and unwavering dedication, my departure had been met with confusion from colleagues and a perfunctory exit interview with HR. My direct supervisor had seemed personally offended, as if my resignation were a critique of his leadership rather than a step toward my own fulfillment. "You're making a mistake, Olivia," he'd said as I turned in my company laptop. "The market for online boutiques is oversaturated. Most fail within 18 months. "I appreciate your concern," I'd replied, the phrase becoming my mantra when faced with doubt. "But I've done my research." Now, standing in my warehouse, I questioned whether my confidence had been misplaced. The space suddenly seemed cavernous, the task ahead monumental. "Stop it," Zoe said, recognizing my expression. "I can literally see you second-guessing yourself. That ends now." She was right. Doubt was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had resigned from my job, invested a significant portion of my savings, and signed a lease. There was no turning back. "The movers will be here with the shelving and workstations in an hour," I said, consulting my phone. "The photographer's arriving at 3 to discuss the setup for product shots." Zoe nodded approvingly. "And the website development? Kickoff?" Meeting tomorrow morning. Dina connected me with a designer who specializes in fashion e-commerce. The next several days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Industrial shelving was assembled, clothing racks positioned, a small office area established in one corner with desks for me and the part-time assistant I planned to hire. A photography area was set up with professional lighting, backdrops, and a dedicated space for styling. My collection of vintage pieces, carefully preserved in my apartment over years, became the first items in inventory. Each evening, I returned to my apartment exhausted but exhilarated. There was a freedom in this work that I had never experienced at Morgan Stanley. Every decision was mine, every success and setback directly connected to my vision and execution. 1 week after securing the warehouse, I received an unexpected message from Talia Wong, a popular sustainable fashion influencer Dina had contacted on my behalf. Intrigued by your concept. Would love to see your curation in person. Available Thursday? I stared at my phone in disbelief. Talia had over 500,000 followers across platforms, and her endorsement could put reclaimed threads on the map immediately. Thursday was just 2 days away, and while I had begun organizing the inventory, the space was far from presentation ready. We'll make it happen, Dina assured me when I called her in a panic. This is too important to pass up. The next 48 hours were a blur of strategic chaos. I called in every favor I had accumulated in my years of networking. Marcus sent 2 of his operations consultants to help organize the inventory system. Zoe arrived with bags from the Container Store and spent hours creating a presentable reception area. A former college roommate who had become an interior designer loaned me vintage furniture pieces to soften the industrial feel of the space. By Thursday morning, the warehouse had been transformed. The front section now resembled a high-end boutique, with carefully selected pieces displayed on custom racks. My office area had been styled to reflect the brand aesthetic: vintage desk accessories, framed fashion illustrations from the 1950s, and fresh flowers softening the industrial edges of the space. When Talia arrived, I was surprised by how young she looked in person, perhaps only 25, but her shrewd assessment of the space told me she was every bit as business savvy as her online presence suggested. Your PR pitch was intriguing, she said after introductions. A finance executive, pivoting to sustainable fashion curation. But I get a lot of pitches. I need to see if your eye for quality matches your business credentials. For the next hour, I guided her through my initial collection, explaining the provenance of key pieces, the sustainability aspects of vintage collection, and my vision for helping modern women incorporate statement vintage pieces into contemporary wardrobes. This Halston jacket, I explained, showing her a perfectly preserved blazer from 1978, was owned by one of the first female executives at Chicago Tribune. I found it at an estate sale in Lincoln Park. The craftsmanship is impeccable. You simply can't find hand-stitched lining like this in contemporary fast fashion. Talia examined the piece with expert hands, checking the stitching, the fabric quality, and the overall condition. How would you style this for a younger client who might be intimidated by vintage? Without hesitation, I grabbed my tablet and showed her a digital styling board I'd created. With high-waisted jeans and a simple white tee for weekend, or over E. A slip dress for evening. The key is balancing the structured silhouette with more relaxed pieces. By the end of her visit, Talia's professional reserve had given way to genuine enthusiasm. You've got something special here, Olivia. It's not just the pieces, though your curation is exceptional. It's the stories behind them and your vision for their second life. She paused, considering. I'd like to do a feature when you launch. Maybe a try-on session with some of your statement pieces, styled my way. We could do it as an Instagram Live that drives to your website launch. It was more than I could have hoped for. That would be incredible, I managed, trying to maintain professional composure while internally doing cartwheels. Send me the launch date details when you have them, she said, heading toward the door. Then she turned back. Oh, And that Halston jacket? I'd like to purchase it when you go live. Consider it on hold. After she left, I called Dina immediately. She wants to do a feature, I exclaimed without preamble. Instagram Live on launch day. Dina's excitement matched mine. This is huge, Olivia. Talia's audience is exactly our target demographic. We need to make sure the website is flawless for the traffic she'll drive. That conversation catalyzed a new wave of activity. The website development was expedited, with daily check-ins on progress. I interviewed and hired 2 part-time assistants, one for inventory management and shipping, another for social media and customer service. Every evening was spent photographing and cataloging new acquisitions, writing detailed descriptions that included each piece's history, condition, and styling suggestions. 3 weeks into the build-out, I received a text from my mother. Haven't heard from you in weeks. Your father and I are concerned. Michael says the vintage clothing market is oversaturated and highly competitive. Are you sure you've thought this through? Of course, Michael had appointed himself an expert on my business. I typed a measured response. Everything is on track. The website launches in 4 weeks. I'll send you the link when it's live. I hesitated, then added, and please tell Michael that his concern is noted, but unnecessary. I've been researching this market for 5 years. It was the most direct I'd ever been about Michael's habit of undermining me. My thumb hovered over the send button for several seconds before I finally pressed it. There was no going back now, in more ways than one. That evening, as I was locking up the warehouse, my phone rang. The screen displayed Michael Jensen. I stared at it, surprised. Michael rarely called me directly, preferring to filter his opinions through our parents. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. Hello? Liv, he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension barely masked as concern. Mom's worried about you, says you're not returning calls. I've been busy, I replied simply. Building a business takes time. About that, he continued, I've been looking into the vintage market. It's more complex than you might realize. The valuation metrics, the scalability challenges. Michael, I interrupted, surprising both of us. I appreciate your concern, but I've been studying this market for years. This isn't an impulse decision. I'm just trying to help, he protested. I have experience with startups that you don't have. Different industries, different business models, I said firmly. But thank you, I need to go now. I ended the call before he could respond, a small act of self-assertion that felt monumental. As I walked to my car, I realized something important. For the first time, I hadn't felt that familiar twist of anxiety when confronted with Michael's doubt. Instead, I had felt something new, the quiet confidence that comes from doing the work, from building something real instead of just talking about it. The implementation phase of Reclaimed Threads was well underway, transforming my vision from concept to reality. With each rack filled, each vintage piece cataloged, each website function tested, I was creating tangible proof that would speak louder than any argument I could make to my doubting family. Success would be the ultimate response to Michael's dismissal. And for the first time, that success felt not just possible, but inevitable. The Reclaimed Threads website was scheduled to launch on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 weeks after I had quit Morgan Stanley. The night before, I sat alone in my warehouse office, surrounded by the evidence of my transformation, racks of meticulously restored vintage pieces, each photographed, measured, and cataloged, shipping supplies neatly organized, marketing materials, ready for distribution. My laptop displayed the website in preview mode, elegant, intuitive, and conveying exactly the aesthetic I had envisioned. The landing page featured a black and white photograph of me, reluctantly taken at Dina's insistence, standing amidst a collection of vintage garments with the tagline, "Every piece tells a story. What will yours be?" I had spent the day double-checking. inventory, confirming details with Talia for her Instagram Live the following week, and finalizing email sequences with Zoe. Now, with nothing left to prepare, doubt crept in. What if no one visited the site? What if they visited but didn't purchase? What if Michael had been right all along? My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Stop overthinking, get some sleep. Tomorrow we make history." I smiled, wondering how she always seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. With one last look around, the space that had become more home to me than my apartment in recent weeks, I gathered my things and headed out. The drive home took me past my parents' neighborhood in Evanston. On impulse, I turned down their street and pulled up outside their house. Lights still glowed in the downstairs windows despite the late hour. For a moment, I contemplated going in, showing them pictures of the warehouse, the website, explaining my vision one more time in hopes they might finally understand. Instead, I drove on. Tomorrow would speak for itself. I barely slept that night, checking my phone every hour as if the website might have mysteriously launched itself ahead of schedule. At 5 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely, made a strong espresso, and opened my laptop. At precisely 8 a.m., I sent the Go Live email to my web developer. Within minutes, Reclaimed Threads was officially open for business. For the first hour, I watched the analytics in real time, heart racing each time a new visitor appeared on the site. Most were friends and connections from the fashion community that Dina had primed with teaser emails, but there were unknown visitors too, people finding the site through the modest paid social media campaign we had launched simultaneously. To 9:17 a.m., it happened. The first sale, a 1960s Pucci silk scarf, purchased by someone in Seattle. I stared at the order confirmation, a wave of emotion washing over me. Someone I didn't know had valued my curation enough to spend $175 on a piece I had personally selected, restored, and presented. I called Zoe immediately. "We got our first sale." "I know," she laughed. "I'm watching the analytics dashboard too. And it's not going to be the last. The social campaign is starting to gain traction. The engagement rates are already above industry average." By noon, we had processed 7 orders. By closing time, the total had reached 23, with an average order value well above what we had projected. More importantly, the customer acquisition cost was significantly lower than budgeted, suggesting the targeting of our marketing efforts was resonating with the right audience. I stayed late at the warehouse that night, personally packaging each order with the care I had always imagined: acid-free tissue paper, handwritten thank you notes describing the provenance of each piece, elegant branded boxes tied with grosgrain ribbon. These weren't just sales. They were the beginning of relationships with customers who shared my appreciation for fashion history and sustainable consumption. The following days brought continued steady growth. Each morning, I arrived at the warehouse to find new orders awaiting fulfillment. Each evening, I left with the satisfaction of having connected unique pieces with new owners who would give them second lives. More encouraging than the sales were the emails from customers, women who described falling in love with the stories behind their purchases, who sent photos of themselves wearing their vintage finds styled in modern, personal ways. 1 week after launch, Talia's Instagram Live session created the spike in traffic we had anticipated. She spent an hour at the warehouse, trying on pieces from our Power Dressing Through the Decades collection, sharing the stories behind each garment with her followers, and modeling how she would style them for contemporary settings. "What makes Reclaimed Threads different?" she told her audience as she twirled in a 1950s Dior cocktail dress, "is that Olivia isn't just selling clothes. She's curating pieces of fashion history and making them relevant for today. Each piece comes with documentation of its provenance and personalized styling advice." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour of the live stream ending, we had received more orders than in the entire previous week combined. By the following morning, several key pieces had sold out completely, including the Halston jacket Talia had reserved during her first visit. 2 weeks after launch, we were featured in Chicago Magazine's Innovators to Watch column. The photographer captured me in the warehouse, surrounded by vintage treasures, looking far more confident than I felt. The article highlighted my unusual career trajectory from finance executive to fashion entrepreneur, casting it as a deliberate evolution rather than the emotional leap of faith it had sometimes felt like. Jensen brings her analytical mindset to the often intuitive world of fashion curation, the writer observed, creating a business model that balances passion with pragmatism. I sent the article to my parents without comment, the first direct communication I had initiated since the group text announcing my decision weeks earlier. My father responded first. Saw the article. The warehouse looks professional. Call when you have time. Not exactly effusive praise, but from my father, it was tantamount to a standing ovation. My mother's response came later that evening. Very impressive, dear. Your brother mentioned he might stop by your shop sometime to see what you've created. I felt a familiar tension at the mention of Michael, but it was duller now, muted by the tangible success I was experiencing. Let him come. Let him see what I had built from the glorified garage sale he had mocked. The most unexpected early victory came 3 weeks post-launch, when I received an email from Miranda Holloway, fashion editor at Vogue. She had purchased a rare 1970s Yves Saint Laurent blazer from our collection and was impressed not only with the piece itself, but with the detailed history I had included. Tracing its journey from the original owner, a prominent Chicago philanthropist, through various private collections. I'm working on a feature about the sustainability movement in fashion, she wrote. Would you be willing to be interviewed about your approach to vintage curation as a form of conservation? The resulting phone interview lasted nearly 2 hours, with Miranda particularly interested in my perspective on the intersection of fashion history and modern sustainability concerns. What you're doing isn't just commerce, she said toward the end of our conversation. It's the preservation of fashion, heritage that might otherwise be lost. When the article appeared online the following week, with a print version scheduled for the upcoming issue, it included a full paragraph about reclaimed threads, describing it as a thoughtful new voice in the vintage market, blending scholarly appreciation for fashion history with accessible modern styling. I printed the article and pinned it to the bulletin board in my office, a tangible reminder on difficult days that what I was building had value beyond mere commercial success. The 1-month mark brought our first financial review. Seated at the conference table in my office with Zoe and Marcus, I reviewed the spreadsheets with the same analytical rigor I had once applied to corporate acquisitions. Revenue is 32% above projections, I noted, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. Customer acquisition cost is 17% below budget, and our retention rate for repeat customers is already at 28%. These are exceptional numbers for a launch phase, Marcus confirmed. Most e-commerce startups don't see this kind of customer retention until at least 6 months in, and the press coverage has been invaluable, Zoe added. We've had over 40 media mentions without spending $1 on PR beyond Dina's consulting fee. The data confirmed what I had begun to feel intuitively. Reclaimed Threads wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We were connecting with exactly the audience I had envisioned. Educated women with disposable income who valued sustainability, craftsmanship, and the stories behind their purchases. As we wrapped up the meeting, I felt a quiet pride that was entirely different from the validation I had sought at Morgan Stanley. This success was mine in a way my corporate achievements had never been, built from personal passion, fueled by conviction when others doubted, shaped by a vision that was uniquely my own. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the warehouse, I received a text from an unfamiliar number, saw the Vogue piece. Impressive work. Thinking of adding a vintage component to our spring collection. Would value your input as a consultant. Let me know if you are interested. Eliza Chen, Design Director, Norden Apparel. Norden was one of the most respected sustainable fashion brands in the country, known for their commitment to ethical production and innovative design. A consulting arrangement with them would not only provide additional revenue, but would position Reclaimed Threads as an authority in the vintage fashion space. I forwarded the text to Dina with a simple message. Is this real? Her response came immediately. 100% real. Eliza and I worked together years ago. She doesn't offer consulting gigs lightly. This is huge. As I drove home that night, I realized how far I had come in just a few short months. From the uncertainty and fear that had followed my dinner with Michael and my parents, to this moment of validation from one of the most respected names in sustainable fashion. It was more than I had dared to hope for so quickly. These early victories weren't just about business success, though. The numbers were certainly encouraging. They were confirmation that I had been right to trust my own vision, despite the doubts of those closest to me. Each sale, each media mention, each industry recognition was a quiet rebuke to Michael's dismissal of my business as a glorified garage sale. I hadn't set out to prove him wrong. I had set out to build something I believed in. But the evidence that I was succeeding certainly made his dismissal easier to bear. The 2-month anniversary of Reclaimed Threads' launch coincided with the beginning of Chicago's prestigious Fashion Focus Week. Thanks to Dina's connections, I had secured a spot in the Emerging Designers and Retailers Showcase, a significant achievement for such a new business. The event would allow me to display a curated collection to industry insiders, press, and potential wholesale clients. I spent weeks preparing, selecting pieces that told a cohesive story about sustainable fashion across decades. My small team had grown to include a part-time vintage specialist who helped source new acquisitions and a merchandising assistant who had previously worked for Barney's New York. The morning of the showcase, I arrived at the venue early to oversee the setup of our display. The space looked exactly as I had envisioned. Clean, modern fixtures contrasting with the textural richness of vintage pieces, large format photographs showing styling possibilities, and an iPad station where attendees could browse our digital catalog. This looks incredible, Zoe said, arriving with coffee for both of us. Professional, distinctive, and perfectly aligned with the brand. I was scanning the room, mentally checking off final preparations, when I froze. Among the crowd of designers and vendors setting up their displays was a familiar figure. Michael, in an impeccably tailored suit, directing a team of assistants as they arranged banners and product displays at a booth directly across from mine. "What is he doing here?" I whispered to Zoe, unable to mask my shock. "Who?" Zoe followed my gaze, her expression darkening. "Your brother. I didn't know Jensen Capital had a fashion division." "They don't," I said, confusion giving way to a sinking feeling. "At least they didn't 8 weeks ago." Michael looked up then, catching my eye across the room. His smile was confident, almost smug, as he excused himself from his team and made his way toward me. "Olivia," he greeted, leaning in for an air kiss that I reluctantly returned. "What a coincidence finding you here." "Is it?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "What exactly is Jensen Capital doing at Fashion Focus Week?" "Oh, we've expanded," he said casually. "After our conversation about your business, I did some research into the sustainable fashion market. Turns out there's significant investment potential in the space. We've launched a new division, Jensen Sustainable Ventures." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You launched a sustainable fashion investment division because I started a vintage clothing business?" Michael laughed, the sound calculated to make me feel paranoid for the suggestion. "Don't be dramatic, Liv. The division has been in development for months. Your little shop was just a timely reminder to finalize the launch." Before I could respond, a young woman approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jensen?" The press coordinator is asking when you'll be available for interviews. Tell them I'm free whenever they're ready, Michael replied smoothly. My sister and I were just catching up. After the assistant departed, he turned back to me. You should stop by our booth later. We're announcing our first portfolio company. Today, Nouveau Vintage. They're doing something similar to your concept, but at scale. E-commerce platform connecting vintage sellers nationwide, backed by our capital and operational expertise. The calculated precision of the attack was breathtaking. Not only had Michael positioned himself in the exact industry he had ridiculed me for entering, but he had funded a direct competitor with a similar concept to reclaimed threads, deliberately timed to overshadow my Fashion Focus Week debut. Fascinating timing, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Especially since you told me the vintage market was oversaturated and unsustainable just 3 months ago. Did I? Michael affected a look of innocent confusion. Well, further. Research changed my perspective. That's the difference between us, Liv. I'm always willing to evolve my thinking based on market data. With that parting shot, he returned to his booth, leaving me standing rigidly in place, a tight smile frozen on my face for the benefit of anyone watching. Zoe materialized at my side immediately. I heard everything. What an unbelievable... Not... Here! I cut her off, conscious of the industry professionals beginning to fill the space. We have a showcase to run. Despite my outward composure, my mind was racing. This wasn't a coincidence or a sudden business decision. This was deliberate. Michael had seen my early success and couldn't tolerate it. Just as he had done throughout our childhood, he was positioning himself to overshadow my achievement, to claim the territory I had staked out as his own. But unlike my childhood science fair project, reclaimed threads couldn't be easily knocked over and dismissed as an accident. I had built something real, with a growing customer base and industry recognition. Michael might have capital and connections, but he didn't have my years of research, my carefully cultivated expertise, or my authentic passion for vintage fashion, as E. The showcase opened to attendees. I forced myself to focus. Each conversation with a potential client or press contact became an opportunity to demonstrate the depth of knowledge and genuine enthusiasm that set reclaimed threads apart. I spoke about the history of particular designers, the evolution of sustainable practices in fashion, the stories behind specific garments in our collection. Throughout the day, I couldn't help noticing the steady stream of visitors to Michael's booth. His team was distributing glossy press kits and promotional items with the Jensen Sustainable Ventures logo. Occasionally, I caught him watching me from across the room, gauging my reaction to his intrusion. During a brief lull, Miranda Holloway from Vogue stopped by my display. Olivia, the collection is stunning, she said, examining a rare 1960s Courrèges dress I had sourced from a private estate. The curation is impeccable. Thank you, I replied, genuinely pleased by her appreciation. I was hoping to show how certain vintage pieces anticipated contemporary sustainability concerns, like this dress, which used innovative synthetic materials, designed for durability and longevity, the opposite of today's fast fashion. Miranda nodded appreciatively. That's exactly the kind of context that makes vintage interesting beyond mere nostalgia. She glanced across the room at Michael's display. Your brother's new venture seems to be making quite a splash, I managed, a measured response. Yes, Michael has always had a talent for spotting market opportunities. But different approaches, wouldn't you say? Miranda mused. Mass market platform versus curated expertise. Interesting to see the same family producing such different business models in the same sector. Her observation gave me pause. Where I had seen only Michael's attempt to overshadow me, Miranda had identified a fundamental distinction between our approaches, one that might actually work to my advantage. As the day progressed, I noticed a pattern in the attendees visiting both our booths. While Michael's display drew curious onlookers and casual browsers, mine attracted more focused interest from serious collectors, boutique owners, and fashion historians. the very people whose business would be most valuable to reclaimed threads, recognized the difference between a capital-fueled platform and a knowledge-driven curation service. By late afternoon, I had collected contact information from 3 high-end boutiques interested in consignment arrangements and had scheduled meetings with 2 private collectors seeking specific acquisitions. More importantly, I had confirmed a follow-up feature with Miranda about the historical significance of sustainable materials in vintage fashion. As the showcase wound down, Michael approached my booth again, his expression confident. "Impressive turnout today," he observed. "Jensen Sustainable Ventures has already signed partnership agreements with 6 regional vintage suppliers for our Nouveau Vintage platform." "Congratulations," I replied evenly. "It sounds like a very different business model from mine." "More scalable," he countered immediately. "More attractive to investors. The individual curator approach has charm, but limited growth potential." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, surprising him with my lack of defensiveness. "But different customers seek different experiences. Some want convenience and breadth. Others want expertise and curation." Michael studied me, seemingly thrown by my composed response. He had clearly expected either heated confrontation or visible distress, my typical reactions to his provocations. My calm analysis of market segmentation left him momentarily without a ready retort. "Mom and Dad are having their anniversary dinner next weekend," he said, changing tactics. "They're hoping you'll attend, though they understand if you're too busy with your boutique." The slight pause before boutique was deliberate, meant to diminish. I recognized the familiar strategy. When direct competition failed to provoke the desired reaction, Michael would invoke family dynamics, positioning himself as the dutiful son while painting me as the difficult daughter, too consumed with proving myself to fulfill family obligations. "I'll be there," I said simply. "Please let them know I'll bring wine from that vineyard in Sonoma they enjoyed last summer." Again, my straightforward response seemed to unbalance him. He nodded, made a non-committal comment about seeing me there, and returned to his team. After he left, Dina appeared at my side. "Your brother is nothing if not predictable," she observed dryly. "Though I have to admit, launching a competitive venture is more dramatic than even I expected." "He's trying to rattle me," I said, beginning to carefully pack away display items. "He wants me defensive and distracted." "And you're not giving him the satisfaction," Dina noted with approval. "But Olivia, this isn't just a psychological game. Jensen Capital entering the sustainable fashion investment space could have real implications for reclaimed threads." "I know," I acknowledged. "But it also confirms something important. What I'm building has value. Michael doesn't waste time on insignificant ventures." As we finished packing up, I took one last look at the now empty Jensen Sustainable Ventures booth across the room. The large banner prominently featured Michael's name and image, positioned as a visionary investor in sustainable fashion, a sector he had dismissed as frivolous just weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother's attempt to undermine my business had instead provided powerful validation of my market research and business concept. His escalation wasn't just petty sibling rivalry. It was a backhanded acknowledgement that I had identified a viable opportunity he had initially missed. This realization brought with it a strange calm. For the first time in our competitive history, I didn't feel diminished by Michael's attempt to claim territory. Instead, I felt oddly validated. He could fund a platform, hire a team, and distribute press kits, but he couldn't replicate the years of knowledge, the genuine passion, or the curatorial eye that made reclaimed threads unique. His escalation wasn't the threat I had initially perceived. It was evidence that the path I had chosen had merit. And in recognizing that, I found myself more focused on refining my own vision than on countering his latest competitive move. My parents' anniversary. Dinner was held at Aurelian, an upscale French restaurant in the Gold Coast neighborhood with views of Lake Michigan. I arrived precisely on time, a bottle of the promised Sonoma Valley Cabernet tucked under my arm. The maitre d' led me to a private dining room where my parents were already seated with Michael and his date, a willowy blonde woman I didn't recognize. "Olivia," my mother greeted me, rising for an embrace that was more formal than affectionate. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd make it." "I said I would," I replied simply, handing my father the wine. "Happy anniversary." My father examined the bottle with approval. "Excellent vintage, thank you." I took the empty seat across from Michael, who introduced his companion as Vanessa, head of PR for Jensen Sustainable Ventures. Of course he had. Brought a business associate rather than a personal date. Every interaction was an opportunity for Michael to advance his agenda. "Congratulations on the launch," Vanessa said smoothly. "Michael has told me so much about your journey from finance to fashion. So inspiring." The subtle emphasis on inspiring rather than impressive confirmed my suspicion that Michael had carefully shaped his narrative about my career change, positioning it as a charming but somewhat impractical pursuit. "Thank you," I responded with genuine warmth, refusing to be baited. The response has exceeded even my projections. "How are you finding the transition from general PR to fashion-specific work?" The question gently highlighted that, unlike me, Vanessa was new to the fashion industry, a fact she acknowledged with a surprised laugh. "It's a learning curve," she admitted. "Fashion has its own language and expectations." "Olivia could probably give you some pointers," my mother suggested, apparently without irony. "She's always had an eye for clothes." "I'd be happy to introduce you to some key industry contacts," I offered sincerely, ignoring the reductive characterization of my expertise as merely an eye for clothes. Dinner proceeded with the familiar rhythms of Jensen family gatherings. My father dominated the conversation with observations about financial markets and city politics. My mother deftly managed the service and flow of the meal while inserting occasional anecdotes about their 40 years of marriage. Michael strategically highlighted recent successes at Jensen Capital, particularly the expansion into emerging sustainable markets. I contributed when appropriate, but found myself observing more than participating, noticing patterns in our family dynamic with newfound clarity. Michael's constant positioning, my father's tacit approval, my mother's careful management of tensions, these weren't new developments but long-standing roles we had all played for decades. What had changed was my relationship to this dynamic. The success of Reclaimed Threads had altered something fundamental in how I perceived myself within the family structure. I was no longer the accommodating daughter seeking validation, but a businesswoman with external confirmation of my value and vision. As dessert was served, my father raised his glass. 40 years with this remarkable woman," he said, nodding toward my mother. "And to our children, who continue to make us proud in their professional achievements." We all clinked glasses, but I noticed Michael watching me closely, as if gauging my reaction to being included in the toast rather than singled out for specific recognition. "Speaking of professional achievements," he said once the moment had passed, "I've been meaning to ask you about your growth strategy, Liv. How do you plan to scale Reclaimed Threads beyond the boutique model?" The question was carefully calculated to highlight what he perceived as the limitation of my business compared to his platform approach. It was also asked in front of my parents, positioning him as the experienced business strategist kindly offering guidance to his less ambitious sister. In the past, I would have either defensively over-explained my business plan or downplayed my ambitions to avoid conflict. Tonight, I took a different approach. That's a common question from people who view all businesses through the lens of rapid scaling and investor returns, I replied calmly. Reclaimed Threads has a different model. We're focused on sustainable growth through deepening customer relationships and expanding our expertise-driven services. Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "But surely you have capital needs for inventory expansion. Mom mentioned you've invested a significant portion of your savings." And there it was. the subtle introduction of financial precarity into the conversation, designed to trigger my parents' concerns. Initial investment is normal for any business, I noted. Our current revenue exceeds projections by 32%, and our margins are healthy. More importantly, we're establishing partnerships with exactly the right segment of the market for our approach. My father, whose attention had been caught by the specific metrics, leaned forward. 32% above projections is impressive for any new venture. What's your customer acquisition cost? 17% below industry standard, I answered without hesitation. And our retention rate is approaching 30% in just our third month of operation. My father nodded, genuine interest replacing the polite attention he had been paying earlier. Sustainable customer acquisition is the real challenge for e-commerce. How are you achieving that efficiency? For the next several minutes, my father and I discussed business metrics in the detailed language of finance professionals. I explained our targeted marketing approach, the value of press coverage in reducing paid acquisition needs, and the high conversion rate among visitors to the website. Michael, unusually, had fallen silent. This direct professional conversation between my father and me, treating my business with the same serious consideration he would give to any investment opportunity, was clearly not the dynamic he had anticipated. When my father finally sat back, seemingly satisfied with my responses, Michael attempted to reclaim control of the narrative. All promising early indicators, he acknowledged with the air of an experienced judge, similar to what we're seeing with Nouveau Vintage, though of course at a different scale. Our platform model allows for much faster expansion across markets. Different approaches serve different segments, I replied, echoing my observation from the showcase. Reclaimed Threads isn't competing with mass market platforms. We're establishing authority in expert curation for collectors and discriminating buyers. An interesting niche, Michael said, the word niche carrying clear implications of limitation. A focused strategy, I corrected pleasantly. Not every business needs to be everything to everyone. My mother, sensing the growing tension beneath our polite exchange, attempted to change the subject. Olivia, we saw that article about you in Chicago Magazine. The photographs were lovely. Thank you, I replied. The Vogue feature next month should bring even more visibility. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Vogue? Yes, I confirmed, unable to entirely suppress a smile at his obvious surprise. They're doing a piece on sustainable fashion. Pioneers! Reclaimed Threads will be featured alongside several established brands. Vanessa, who clearly understood the significance of Vogue coverage for a new fashion business, looked impressed despite herself. That's quite an achievement for a startup. Olivia has always had good media relationships, Michael interjected smoothly, attempting to reframe my success as a public relations achievement rather than recognition of business merit. I let the comment pass without correction, recognizing it as another attempt to diminish what he couldn't directly challenge. As we finished dessert and coffee, my father asked the question that had likely been his primary motivation for this family. Dinner. So what's next for both of you? Michael, you mentioned expansion plans for Jensen Sustainable Ventures? Michael launched into a detailed outline of his division's growth targets, emphasizing capital deployment and regional expansion. The subtext was clear. His business was about scale and financial returns, measurable markers of success that our father had always valued. When he finished, my father turned to me. And reclaimed Threads? 5 months ago, I might have downplayed my ambitions or framed them in terms that mirrored Michael's focus on conventional metrics. Tonight, I chose honesty. We're focusing on 3 growth areas, I explained. First, expanding our authentication and appraisal services for private collectors. Second, developing exclusive vintage sourcing relationships with design houses researching their archives. Third, launching a limited capsule collection of contemporary pieces inspired by historical designs. Manufacturing new clothes? Michael interrupted, sounding genuinely surprised. That's a significant deviation from the vintage model. Not manufacturing, I clarified. Commissioning limited edition pieces from independent artisans using sustainable materials and methods. It's a natural extension of our commitment to quality craftsmanship and fashion history. That sounds more like a curator becoming a creator, my father observed thoughtfully. Exactly, I agreed, pleased that he had grasped the concept so quickly. It's about bridging fashion history with sustainable future practices. The conversation continued as we moved to after-dinner drinks, but a subtle shift had occurred. For the first time in our family dynamic, my business approach was being discussed on its own merits, not in comparison to Michael's. My father asked thoughtful questions about my specific plans, showing genuine interest rather than polite attention. Michael, unaccustomed to sharing the spotlight during family gatherings, grew increasingly tense. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way he repeatedly steered the conversation back to Jensen's sustainable ventures whenever possible. As the evening drew to a close, my parents prepared to leave for a weekend at their lake house in Michigan. My father surprised me by taking me aside while my mother collected her things. Your numbers are solid, he said without preamble, and your strategic focus is clear. If you need capital for expansion at some point, I'd be interested in discussing terms. The offer, delivered in his characteristically direct manner, was unprecedented. My father had never offered to invest in any venture of mine, always maintaining that I needed to make my own way professionally. Thank you, I said carefully. I'll keep that in mind. He nodded once, then rejoined my mother. After they departed, I found myself alone at the table with Michael and Vanessa, an awkward triangle of unspoken tension. Well, Michael said finally, his smile not reaching his eyes. It seems Dad is impressed with your little shop. He's impressed with sound business fundamentals, I corrected gently. As he should be. Fundamentals only take you so far, Michael countered. Scaling requires capital and infrastructure, things Jensen Sustainable Ventures has in abundance. I met his gaze directly. Michael, why did you launch a sustainable fashion venture 3 months after telling me the market was oversaturated? And doomed to fail? The bluntness of my question clearly caught him off guard. Vanessa, sensing the shift from professional rivalry to personal confrontation, murmured something about checking emails and discreetly left the table. Business decisions aren't personal, Liv, he said after a moment. I identified an opportunity and pursued it. That's what entrepreneurs do. An opportunity you only identified after dismissing my business concept and then seeing its early success, I pointed out. Michael's expression hardened. If you're implying I copied your idea, I'm not implying anything, I interrupted calmly. I'm directly stating that your sudden interest in sustainable fashion coincided exactly with reclaimed threads gaining traction. After years of mocking my obsession with vintage clothing, you're now positioning yourself as a visionary investor in the space. That's ridiculous, he scoffed, but the flush creeping up his neck betrayed his discomfort. Is it? I asked softly. You've been doing this our entire lives, Michael. When I succeed at something, you either diminish it or attempt to overshadow it. The only difference now is that I'm no longer pretending not to notice. The confrontation that had been building since Fashion Focus Week, indeed, since childhood, had finally arrived. But unlike previous conflicts with my brother, I felt no anxiety, no desperate need to either appease or convince him. I was simply stating observable truth, calmly and directly. Michael stared at me, seemingly thrown by this new version of his typically accommodating sister. For a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge the pattern. Instead, he fell back, on familiar deflection. You've always been competitive with me, he said, shaking his head as if saddened by this realization. Always trying to prove yourself, always resenting my success. I smiled, recognizing the attempted reversal for what it was. That narrative worked when I was seeking your approval, Michael. It doesn't work anymore. I stood, gathering my purse. I need to check inventory tomorrow morning, so I should get going. Tell Vanessa I enjoyed meeting her. As I turned to leave, Michael's voice stopped me. This isn't over, you know. Jensen Sustainable Ventures has resources you can't match. Nouveau, vintage will dominate the online vintage market within a year. I looked back at him, struck by the naked insecurity beneath his threat. For the first time, I saw my brother clearly, not as the golden child whose approval I had sought, but as someone whose sense of self was so dependent on superiority that he couldn't bear to see me succeed independently. I wish you well with your platform, I said sincerely. But Reclaimed Threads isn't competing in that space. We never were. As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt lighter than I had in years. The confrontation that had loomed so large in my imagination had finally occurred, and I had emerged neither defensive nor defeated, but simply clear. The spell of Michael's judgment, his power to define my worth through comparison to his achievements, had been broken. The morning after my confrontation with Michael, I arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual, driven by a strange mix of energy and clarity. The space felt different somehow, more definitively mine, as if standing up to my brother had somehow reinforced my ownership of not just the physical business, but the vision behind it. I was measuring a newly acquired 1940s evening gown for the website when my phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. SOS, check your email. Michael's team just sent a press release to every fashion publication in Chicago. With a sense of foreboding, I opened my laptop and found the email Zoe had forwarded. The subject line read, Jensen Sustainable Ventures announces acquisition of Fee. Vintage Vault, Chicago's premier vintage retailer? My heart sank as I scanned the contents. Vintage Vault was one of Chicago's oldest and most respected vintage clothing stores, a 3-generation family business with a loyal customer base and an extensive inventory of museum-quality pieces. The press release highlighted Michael's commitment to preserving fashion heritage through strategic investment in established vintage enterprises, and announced plans to integrate Vintage Vault's inventory and expertise into the Nouveau Vintage platform. The timing and targeting couldn't have been more deliberate. Michael had acquired my most significant local competitor less than 12 hours after our confrontation, positioning Jensen Sustainable Ventures as the savior of a beloved Chicago institution rather than a corporate interloper. The phone rang. Dina, undoubtedly having seen the same press release. Have you seen it? She asked without preamble. Just now, I confirmed, my voice steadier than I expected. Vintage Vault. Smart move. It's a direct challenge, Dina said, her PR instincts immediately identifying the strategic implications. He's not just entering your space anymore. He's claiming the heritage and community credibility that would normally take years to build. She was right. By acquiring Vintage Vault, Michael had instantly positioned Nouveau Vintage as the continuation of a Chicago tradition rather than a corporate newcomer. The family that had owned Vintage Vault for decades was beloved in the local fashion community, their store a landmark for collectors and enthusiasts. The question is, Dina continued, how do we respond? Silence could be interpreted as defeat, but a direct counter could seem petty or defensive. I found myself staring at the rack of carefully restored vintage pieces I had selected for a special collection. Each garment represented hours of research, meticulous authentication, and thoughtful preservation, the kind of hands-on expertise that couldn't be acquired through corporate takeover. We don't counter, I said, the strategy crystallizing as I spoke. We continue. Today, we published that blog post about fashion preservation techniques that we've been working on. Tomorrow, we go ahead with the collector's workshop as planned. We stick to our expertise-driven approach and let Michael play his game of acquisitions. No acknowledgement of the Vintage Vault acquisition at all? Dina sounded skeptical. When appropriate, we congratulate them publicly and sincerely, I clarified. Vintage Vault deserves respect for their legacy, but we don't shift our strategy or messaging in reaction. That's exactly what Michael wants, to force us into a defensive position. After ending the call, I sat at my desk, thinking through the implications of Michael's move. The acquisition of Vintage Vault wasn't just a business maneuver, it was a personal statement, his response to my refusal to be intimidated at dinner the night before. By acquiring a vintage retailer with 3 generations of history, he was explicitly challenging my claim to fashion expertise and community connection. But as I considered the situation more deeply, I began to see the opportunity within the challenge. Michael's high-profile acquisition would bring mainstream attention to vintage fashion in Chicago, potentially expanding the overall market rather than simply redistributing existing customers. More importantly, his corporate approach to vintage retail would likely create space for reclaimed threads to further differentiate our more personal, curatorial model. I spent the morning drafting a careful public statement congratulating Vintage Vault on their new chapter and acknowledging their important role in Chicago's fashion history. The message was genuine in its respect for the family business, while subtly emphasizing the value of personal curation and expertise in vintage collection, reclaimed thread's key differentiator. By mid-afternoon, the story had been picked up by local business publications and fashion blogs. Some directly contrasted Michael's platform-based approach with Reclaimed Thread's curatorial model, positioning us as complementary rather than competitive businesses serving different segments of the vintage market. One fashion blogger wrote, "Jensen Sustainable Ventures' acquisition of Vintage Vault represents the corporatization of vintage retail, while Reclaimed Threads exemplifies the curator-driven model. Both approaches have merit, but they serve fundamentally different customer needs and experiences." This framing, which had emerged organically from the fashion community, rather than from any messaging on my part, was exactly the distinction I had been trying to establish since Michael first launched his competitive venture. As I was reviewing online coverage of the acquisition, my assistant appeared at my office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, looking slightly confused. "Eleanor Jensen? She says she's your mother." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. My mother had never visited the warehouse, had never shown any interest in seeing the physical manifestation of my business beyond polite inquiries about how the shop is going. "Please show her in," I said, quickly tidying the papers on my desk. My mother entered tentatively, looking oddly out of place among the racks of vintage clothing in her conservative St. John knit suit and pearl earrings. She carried a shopping bag from a high-end department store and seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mom," I greeted her, rising from my desk. "This is a surprise." "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, glancing around the space with evident curiosity. "Your father and I were supposed to leave for Michigan this morning, but I decided to stay behind for a day. I wanted to see your business for myself." The simple admission that she had altered plans to visit my warehouse was so unprecedented that I found myself momentarily at a loss for words. "I'd be happy to show you around," I finally managed. "Would you like some coffee or tea first?" She declined politely, and I gave her the tour I had given dozens of clients and industry visitors over the past months, explaining our inventory organization, our authentication processes, our approach to restoration and preservation. To my surprise, she asked thoughtful questions about the provenance of specific pieces and the stories behind them. When we reached my office, she set down the shopping bag she had been carrying and removed a garment carefully wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought something I thought might interest you," she said, unfolding the tissue to reveal a stunning 1950s Chanel suit in deep burgundy wool. "This was my mother's. She wore it to gallery openings in Paris when your grandfather was stationed, there after the war." I took the suit with reverent hands, examining the impeccable construction and the signature Chanel details, the braided trim, the chain-weighted hem, the silk lining. "Mom, this is museum quality," I said, genuinely awed. "I had no idea you had this." There's a small collection, she admitted. Your grandmother was quite fashion-forward for her time. I've kept her special pieces, though I've never had her flair for wearing them. She watched as I examined the suit, noting its excellent condition and historical significance. I thought perhaps you might like to have it for your collection. It seems more appropriate here than sitting in my cedar closet. The gesture was so unexpected, so uncharacteristically sentimental from my typically practical mother, that I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. I'd be honored, I said softly. Thank you. We sat in my office, and for the first time in years, perhaps ever, my mother and I had a conversation that wasn't filtered through family dynamics or comparisons to Michael. She asked about the Vogue feature, about my plans for expansion, about the customers who were drawn to reclaimed threads. I found myself sharing details of the business I had carefully withheld at family gatherings, knowing she was actually listening, rather than merely waiting for an opportunity to highlight Michael's latest achievement. Eventually, the conversation circled back to the news of the day. I saw the announcement about your brother's acquisition, she said carefully. Vintage Vault has been a Chicago institution for years. I nodded, waiting to see where she would take this observation. Your approaches are very different, she continued, surprising me with her perception. Michael has always believed in growth through acquisition and capital deployment. You seem to be building something more personal. Different models serve different purposes, I said, echoing my response to Michael the night before. Reclaimed Threads isn't trying to be the biggest vintage retailer. We're focused on being the most knowledgeable, the most trusted curator. For our specific clients. My mother seemed to consider this distinction carefully. Your brother called this morning, she said after a moment. He wanted to make sure we'd seen the press release about Vintage Vault. I'm sure he did, I replied, unable to keep a hint of dryness from my tone. To my surprise, my mother smiled slightly, a knowing expression I had rarely seen directed at Michael's behavior. He's always needed recognition, hasn't he? Even as a child. If he scored a goal in soccer, he wouldn't be satisfied until every person at the field had acknowledged it. The simple observation, so obvious yet so rarely articulated in our family, created an unexpected moment of connection between us. For the first time, my mother was acknowledging, however indirectly, the dynamic that had shaped so much of my relationship with my brother. I think that's why your business bothers him, she continued thoughtfully. You built it quietly, without seeking his approval or even his notice. And now it's succeeding on terms he didn't establish. I stared at her, astonished by this insight. Has she always seen the pattern so clearly? Had she simply chosen not to address it? I should get back to the lake house, she said, rising before I could formulate a response. Your father will be wondering where I am. At the door, she paused. The warehouse is impressive, Olivia. What you've built here, it has substance, real value. Coming from my mother, this simple acknowledgement felt monumental. She had seen my business with her own eyes and recognized its merit, separate from any comparison to Michael's ventures. After she left, I carefully hung my grandmother's Chanel suit on a padded hanger in my office where I could see it daily. Tangible reminder that legacies and connections exist beyond competitive dynamics, that some things have value simply because of their history and craftsmanship, not because of their market position or scalability. The day that had begun with Michael's calculated attack on my business had ended with an unexpected affirmation of its core values. My brother had acquired a vintage institution with corporate tactics and press releases. My mother had shared a piece of family fashion history with care and recognition of its proper home. In that contrast lay the resolution to the immediate crisis Michael had attempted to create. His acquisition of Vintage Vault wasn't a threat to reclaimed threads. It was merely a different approach to the market, one that would attract different customers and partners than those who valued my curatorial model. The clarity of this understanding brought with it a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Michael could continue his campaign of competitive escalation, but he couldn't force me into a rivalry that didn't serve my business or my well-being. I had found my path, and it didn't need to intersect with his to be valid or valuable. In the weeks following Michael's acquisition of Vintage Vault, I found myself in an unexpected position. Rather than struggling to defend reclaimed threads against a powerful competitor, I was fielding increased interest from clients, press, and industry partners. The contrast between Michael's corporate platform approach and my expertise-driven curation model had created a clearer market positioning for both businesses, with many vintage enthusiasts explicitly choosing sides based on their preferences for the shopping experience. Nouveau Vintage, under Jensen's Sustainable Ventures direction, quickly expanded its online presence, absorbing smaller vintage retailers into its platform and focusing on volume and accessibility. Meanwhile, Reclaimed Threads deepened its reputation for exceptional curation, authentication expertise, and personalized service. We were mentioned in the same articles and industry analyses, but increasingly as complementary rather than competitive forces in the vintage market. On a personal level, the shift was even more profound. The direct confrontation with Michael at our parents' anniversary dinner, followed by my mother's surprising visit to the warehouse, had altered something fundamental in our family dynamic. The patterns hadn't disappeared. Michael still positioned himself as the more successful sibling at family gatherings. My father still measured achievements in terms of scale and capital deployment. My mother still mediated tensions, but my relationship to these patterns had changed irrevocably. 6 months after launching Reclaimed Threads, I found myself standing in the Chicago Art Institute at the opening reception for a special exhibition, Fashion as Art, a Century of Design Innovation. Reclaimed Threads had been invited to loan 3 significant pieces from our collection for the display, a professional recognition that validated years of careful study and authentication work. "This is major, Liv," Zoe whispered as we sipped champagne and observed attendees admiring the exhibition. "Museum exhibition status in your first year of business? That's unheard of." I nodded, still somewhat in disbelief. The curator was specifically interested in the 1930s Schiaparelli jacket with the hand-painted buttons. Apparently, it's one of only 5 known examples still in existence. "And to think you found it at that estate sale in Evanston where the A family thought it was just grandma's old clothes," Zoe laughed. "This is why your business model works. You recognize value where others don't see it." As we circulated through the gallery, several attendees approached me with questions about vintage authentication and preservation. I found myself engaged in detailed conversations about fabric analysis, designer signatures, and historical context, discussions that reinforced both my expertise and my genuine passion for fashion history. Midway through the evening, I was surprised to see my parents enter the gallery, my father looking characteristically distinguished in a tailored suit, my mother elegant in navy silk. They spotted me immediately and made their way through the crowd. "Your assistant told us about the exhibition when we called the warehouse," my mother explained after greetings were exchanged. "We thought we should see it for ourselves. The Schiaparelli is exceptional," my father commented, gesturing toward the display case containing the jacket I had authenticated. "Your mother recognized it immediately from a similar piece she saw at the Metropolitan Museum years ago." This casual acknowledgement that my father recognized the significance of the piece, that my mother had the knowledge to identify it, that they had made a point of attending the exhibition, represented a shift I was still adjusting to. They weren't comparing my achievement to Michael's or viewing my business as a temporary diversion from a real career. They were engaging with it on its own merits. As we stood discussing the exhibition, the gallery director approached, greeting me warmly and introducing herself to my parents. "Your daughter's expertise has been invaluable to this exhibition," she told them. The provenance research she provided for the Schiaparelli piece helped us establish a connection to the surrealist art movement that became central to the exhibition narrative. My father's expression of measured approval was as close to beaming as his reserved personality allowed. My mother squeezed my arm gently, a small gesture that conveyed more than any verbal praise could have. After they moved on to examine other displays, Zoe nudged me. Did I just witness your parents showing genuine pride in reclaimed threads, without once mentioning your brother? I think you did, I confirmed, still processing the interaction myself. Speaking of your brother, Zoe said, her tone shifting. Slightly. Isn't that him by the entrance? I turned to see Michael standing in the gallery doorway, surveying the scene with his characteristic calculating gaze. When our eyes met, he nodded once, then made his way toward me. Olivia, he greeted, me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. Quite an event. I'm surprised to see you here, I said honestly. Fashion exhibitions aren't usually your scene. Professional interest, he replied smoothly. Jensen Sustainable Ventures is considering a series of pop-up exhibitions to highlight pieces from the Nouveau Vintage collection. I'm here to observe the format. The familiar strategy, positioning his interest as purely business-related while implying plans to replicate and supersede my achievement, might once have triggered anxiety or defensiveness. Tonight, I found it almost amusing in its predictability. The Art Institute curatorial team is excellent, I said simply. I'm sure they'd be happy to discuss their approach if you're interested. Michael glanced around the gallery, noting the attendees engaged in animated discussions about the displayed pieces. The vintage market has proven more robust than initial. Data suggested, he said, the closest he would come to acknowledging that his dismissal of my business concept had been misguided. Different segments have different growth patterns, I agreed neutrally. The investment-grade vintage sector has been particularly strong this year. Our conversation continued in this vein. Professional, superficially cordial, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the personal dynamics underlying our business rivalry. Yet something had shifted in the balance between us. In this setting, a prestigious cultural institution displaying pieces I had authenticated, surrounded by industry professionals who valued my specific expertise, Michael couldn't easily dismiss or overshadow my achievements. When he eventually excused himself to speak with a potential investor he'd spotted across the room, Zoe rejoined me. Well, that was almost civil, she observed. No passive-aggressive jabs, no overt attempts to diminish your success. Progress, I suppose, I said, watching as Michael seamlessly inserted himself into a conversation with gallery donors. Or recognition. That his usual tactics don't work anymore, Zoe suggested. You've established yourself in a space where his financial leverage isn't the only, or even the primary measure of success. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, I found myself standing alone before the display case containing the Schiaparelli jacket. Its architectural lines and whimsical hand-painted buttons represented everything I loved about vintage fashion. The marriage of artistry and craftsmanship, the tangible connection to design history, the individual expression, within formal constraints. It really is extraordinary, came a voice beside me. I turned to find the Art Institute's chief curator, a woman whose scholarly articles on fashion history I had studied for years. The way Schiaparelli collaborated with artists of her time, integrating surrealist elements into wearable designs, it was revolutionary, I replied. Exactly. She nodded appreciatively. Which is why your contribution to this exhibition is so valuable. Vintage pieces in private collections like yours help fill critical gaps in the historical record. Her comment crystallized something I had been feeling throughout the evening. Reclaimed threads wasn't just a business, it was a form of cultural preservation, a bridge between fashion history and contemporary appreciation. The value I created wasn't measured solely in revenue or profit margins, but in knowledge preserved, craftsmanship honored, stories told. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. What had begun as a career, Change driven partly by personal fulfillment and partly by a desire to prove my brother wrong had evolved into something far more meaningful. I had built a business that aligned perfectly with my values and expertise, that contributed to a field I genuinely cared about, that connected me to a community of like-minded individuals who valued what I valued. The competition with Michael, once so central to my motivations and anxieties, had receded in importance. It hadn't disappeared entirely. His acquisition of Vintage Vault and his appearance at the exhibition opening confirmed that our professional paths would continue to intersect in the vintage fashion market. But the power of his judgment, his approval or disapproval, had diminished to the point of irrelevance. I thought about the moment 6 months earlier when I had sat at my parents' dinner table, enduring his mockery of my business concept, feeling the familiar weight of being the lesser sibling, the one whose achievements would always be measured against his and found wanting. That version of myself, seeking validation, vulnerable to his dismissal, seemed distant now, almost unrecognizable. The most significant aftermath of our confrontation wasn't a change in Michael's behavior or even in our family's dynamics, though both had shifted in noticeable ways. It was the transformation in how I perceived myself and my work. I no longer needed external validation, from Michael, from my parents, from former colleagues, to recognize the value of what I had built. Reclaimed. Threads had succeeded not in spite of being different from Jensen's sustainable ventures, but because of that difference. Where Michael's approach was broad, mine was deep. Where his was corporate, mine was personal. Where his prioritized scale, mine emphasized expertise. These distinctions weren't deficiencies to be defended, but deliberate choices to be celebrated. As I pulled into my parking space at home, I received a text from an unknown number. Impressive exhibition. Your authentication work on the Schiaparelli is noteworthy. Would you consider consulting on a special collection? Eliza Chen, Design Director, Norden Apparel. The timing felt significant, this opportunity arriving on the night I had fully recognized my independence from Michael's judgment. 6 months earlier, I might have immediately shared such validation with my family, seeking their acknowledgement of my success. Tonight, I simply smiled and made a mental note to respond in the morning. The aftermath of confronting Michael's attempts to overshadow my business wasn't dramatic vindication or public triumph. It was something quieter but more profound, the freedom to pursue excellence on my own terms, to value what I believed was valuable, to measure success by standards that mattered to me rather than to him. In that freedom, I had found not just professional satisfaction, but personal peace. A resolution that transcended the immediate crisis of sibling rivalry to address the deeper question of self-definition that had always been at its core. 1 year after launching Reclaimed Threads, I stood in the center of our expanded warehouse space, surveying the transformation. What had begun as a modest startup with racks of carefully curated vintage pieces had evolved into a thriving business with multiple revenue streams. The original warehouse floor now housed not only our inventory, but also a consultation area for private clients, a small photography studio for catalog work, and a dedicated authentication station equipped with specialized tools and reference materials. The expansion hadn't been part of my original business plan, at least not so soon, but the unexpected success of our authentication and appraisal services had accelerated the timeline. Collectors, auction houses, and even museums had begun seeking our expertise, creating a robust secondary business alongside our retail operations. The quarterly numbers look strong, Marcus observed, joining me for our regular business review. Revenue is up 47% year over year, with the consulting services growing at nearly twice the rate of retail sales. I nodded, reviewing the spreadsheets on my tablet. The margin on consulting is significantly higher too. Lower overhead, less inventory risk. And harder for competitors to replicate, Marcus added meaningfully. authentication expertise isn't something you can scale with capital infusion alone. The unspoken comparison to Michael's business hung in the air. In the month since his acquisition of Vintage Vault, Jensen's Sustainable Ventures had continued its aggressive expansion of the Nuvo Vintage platform, absorbing smaller vintage retailers and building an extensive online marketplace. Their approach prioritized breadth over depth, thousands of items across price points, with minimal authentication beyond basic categorization. Speaking of competition, Marcus continued, have you seen the latest industry report? There's an interesting section on market segmentation in vintage retail. He pulled up a document on his tablet and passed it to me. The report, published by a respected fashion industry analysis firm, included a detailed breakdown of the vintage market, identifying two dominant models: the platform approach, exemplified by Nuvo Vintage, and the curatorial approach, represented by Reclaimed Threads. According to their analysis, the two models are serving increasingly distinct customer segments, Marcus pointed out. The platform attracts volume-oriented casual buyers, while the curatorial model appeals to collectors, designers, and higher-end consumers seeking authentication and provenance. I skimmed the analysis with interest. So, we're not even competing for the same customers anymore. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. You've effectively carved out a separate market segment, one that values exactly what you offer: expertise, curation, and authentication, and is willing to pay a premium for it. The validation of our business model was gratifying, but it was the separation from direct competition with Michael's venture that struck me as most significant. We had moved beyond the simplistic rivalry that had initially colored my approach to the business. Reclaimed Threads wasn't succeeding in opposition to Nuvo Vintage, it was thriving in an entirely different ecosystem. After Marcus left, I turned my attention to a more personal matter that had been on my mind recently. My lease on the apartment in Wicker Park was ending, and I had been considering my options. The business was stable enough now that I could consider purchasing property, something I had been reluctant to commit to in the uncertain early months of entrepreneurship. As I browsed real estate listings on my laptop, a notification popped up on my phone, an email from the Chicago Business Journal. The subject line made my heart skip. Request for comment, Jensen Capital Restructuring. I opened the email to find a journalist seeking my perspective on a breaking business story. Jensen Capital, my brother's firm, was undergoing significant restructuring following disappointing performance in several key investment areas. Jensen Sustainable Ventures, including the Nuvo Vintage platform, was notably absent from the list of divisions being maintained under the reorganization. The email concluded with a direct question. As Michael Jensen's sister and a successful entrepreneur in the vintage fashion space, do you have any comment on the restructuring of Jensen Capital and the apparent divestment of Jensen Sustainable Ventures? I set the phone down, processing the implications. This wasn't just another business development. It was potentially the end of Michael's venture into the vintage fashion market, the competitive enterprise he had launched specifically to overshadow my success with Reclaimed Threads. My first impulse was to ignore the request entirely. Commenting publicly on my brother's business difficulties seemed unnecessarily provocative, regardless of our complicated history. But as I considered the situation more carefully, I realized this moment represented an important juncture, not just for our businesses, but for our relationship. I composed a careful response. While I'm not privy to the internal decisions at Jensen Capital, business restructuring is a normal part of strategic evolution for any company. Michael Jensen has always been an adept navigator of changing market conditions. As for the vintage fashion sector, it continues to demonstrate strong potential for businesses with focused expertise and clear value propositions. Reclaimed Threads remains committed to our specialization in authentication, curation, and preservation of significant vintage pieces. The statement was professional and neutral, acknowledging neither satisfaction at his apparent setback nor false concern. It reflected the businesswoman I had become, one who could comment on market conditions without personal animus, who could acknowledge a competitor's challenges without gloating or defensiveness. After sending the response, I called Zoe, who had likely seen the news already. "Have you heard about Jensen Capital?" she asked immediately upon answering. "Just saw it," I confirmed. The Business Journal reached out for comment. "What did you say?" I recounted my response. "Perfect," Zoe approved. "Professional, not personal. Though I wouldn't blame you for feeling a little vindicated. It's more complicated than that," I admitted. "Yes, Michael launched Jensen Sustainable Ventures specifically to compete with me, and yes, there's a certain irony in its apparent failure. But I don't take pleasure in anyone's business difficulties, even his." There was a pause before Zoe responded. "You know what's remarkable about that statement? A year ago, I wouldn't have believed it. Now, I do. You've moved beyond the rivalry in a way I honestly didn't expect." Her observation gave me pause. She was right. My response to Michael's business challenges wasn't the satisfied vindication I might have anticipated when he first launched his competing venture. Instead, I felt a more complex mix of emotions, a certain professional detachment regarding the market forces at play, mild curiosity about what had gone wrong, and even a touch of genuine sympathy for the public nature of the setback. The next morning, I received a text from my father. "Dinner tonight? Your mother and I would appreciate your perspective on some matters." The formal wording and unusual request suggested this wasn't a routine family gathering. I agreed, and that evening found myself at my parents' Evanston home for the first time, in several months. The atmosphere was subdued, with my mother unusually quiet, and my father more contemplative than I had seen him in years. After preliminaries, my father came directly to the point. "I assume you've heard about the restructuring." "At Jensen Capital," I nodded. "I saw the news yesterday. What you may not know is that Michael has been struggling with the business for some time," my father continued. "The Sustainable Ventures division, in particular, has been hemorrhaging capital without establishing sustainable revenue streams. This was significantly more detail than my father would typically share about family business matters, especially regarding Michael. The departure from the pattern was striking. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully, unsure of my role in this conversation. My father nodded, seeming to appreciate my measured response. "The vintage fashion platform, Nouveau Vintage, is being divested entirely. The acquisition of Vintage Vault has proven especially problematic. The integration costs exceeded projections, and the expected synergies failed to materialize." I absorbed this information, wondering why my father was sharing these details with me. Was he seeking my reaction? My advice? My assurance that I wouldn't capitalize on Michael's business difficulties? "Michael has been reluctant to discuss the situation with us directly," my mother finally spoke up. "He's always kept his professional challenges private, especially from family." "That's understandable," I replied, thinking of how Michael had always positioned himself as the unfailingly successful sibling, the golden standard against which I was measured. Admitting business failure, particularly in a venture explicitly designed to overshadow my success, would be nearly impossible for him. "What we'd like to understand," my father said, coming to his purpose, "is whether there might be an opportunity here for collaboration rather than competition." I blinked, momentarily speechless. Between Reclaimed Threads and Jensen Sustainable Ventures? Or whatever form the vintage fashion assets might take post-divestiture, my father clarified. The inventory and client list from Vintage Vault in particular represents significant value that aligns more naturally with your business model than with a platform approach. The suggestion was so unexpected that I struggled to formulate a response. My father was essentially proposing that I acquire or partner with the very business Michael had launched to compete with me, a reversal so complete it seemed almost fictional. That would be complicated, I finally managed. Beyond the business considerations, there's the personal history to consider. My father nodded, acknowledging the understatement. Michael's pride has always been his greatest vulnerability, he said, surprising me with his candor. But he's also a pragmatist when necessary. The current situation may require pragmatism. As the conversation continued, I began to understand the long-term consequences that were unfolding. Michael's attempt to overshadow my business had backfired, significantly, creating financial strain for his primary company. My parents, who had once tacitly supported his competitive behavior, were now approaching me as the stable, successful sibling who might help resolve a family business crisis. Dinner concluded without any firm decisions or commitments, but the shift in family dynamics was unmistakable. For the first time in our adult lives, I was being positioned as the family problem solver rather than the family underachiever. My business acumen, once dismissed in favor of Michael's more aggressive approach, was now being sought as a potential solution to his difficulties. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the irony of the situation. Michael had launched Jensen Sustainable Ventures to prove he could succeed in the vintage fashion market more dramatically than I had with reclaimed threads. Now, barely a year later, his venture was being divested while mine was thriving. The long-term consequences of our rivalry were materializing in ways neither of us could have anticipated. What had begun as Michael's attempt to overshadow my business had instead catalyzed my complete independence from his judgment and approval. What had started as my defensive reaction to his dismissal had evolved into a successful enterprise built on genuine passion and expertise, rather than competitive drive. Most significantly, the family dynamic that had defined our relationship. Since childhood, Michael as the golden child, me as the eternal runner-up, had been fundamentally altered. Not through confrontation or vindication, but through the gradual, irrefutable evidence of our respective choices and their outcomes. 18 months after launching Reclaimed Threads, I stood in the doorway of our newest acquisition, a storefront in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood that would become our first physical retail location. The space had previously housed a high-end bookstore with elegant built-in shelving, original crown molding, and worn hardwood floors that told the story of decades of careful use. "It's perfect," Zoe declared, spinning slowly to take in the space. "Exactly the right balance of history and possibility." I nodded, already envisioning how we would transform the space while honoring its character. Display cases along this wall, a consultation area in the back corner, maybe a small exhibit space for the museum-quality pieces. My phone buzzed with a text from Dina. "Just confirmed. Vogue's September issue will feature the Reclaimed Threads. Profile. 4 pages with photographs from the new space. Need to schedule the shoot within 2 weeks." This national recognition was the culmination of 18 months of steady growth and increasing industry respect. What had begun as a passionate career pivot had evolved into a significant business with multiple revenue streams: curated vintage retail, authentication and appraisal services, consulting for designers and museums, and most recently, a limited collection of contemporary pieces inspired by historical designs. As I shared the news with Zoe, my phone rang with my mother's ringtone, a weekly occurrence now, as she had taken a genuine interest in the business over the past year. "I just drove past the new storefront," she said after greetings were exchanged. "The location is exceptional." "I think so too," I agreed. "We're signing the lease tomorrow." "Your father and I were wondering if you're free for dinner this weekend," she continued. "There's something we'd like to discuss with you. Michael will be there as well." I felt a momentary tension at the mention of my brother. Since the restructuring of Jensen Capital and the divestiture of Jensen Sustainable Ventures, our interactions had been minimal and carefully cordial. He had never directly acknowledged the failure of his venture into the vintage fashion market, and I had never asked about it. Our family gatherings had taken on a new pattern, less competitive, more genuinely conversational, but with the unspoken subject of our business rivalry hovering beneath the surface. "I should be able to make it," I said, mentally rearranging my weekend plans. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," my mother assured me. "Just some family matters to discuss." After ending the call, I returned my attention to the storefront, pushing aside thoughts of the upcoming family dinner to focus on the exciting development before me. This physical location represented a new phase for Reclaimed Threads, a bridge between our digital presence and the tangible experience of vintage fashion that couldn't be fully conveyed online. The week passed in a whirlwind of activity, finalizing the lease, meeting with architects about the storefront renovation, coordinating with Vogue for the upcoming photo shoot. By Saturday evening, when I arrived at my parents' home for dinner, I was riding a wave of professional satisfaction that made even the prospect of an awkward family gathering seem manageable. Michael was already there when I arrived, nursing a scotch in the living room while my father discussed some recent market developments. He looked different somehow, less polished, more human. The perpetual confidence that had once seemed his defining characteristic had been tempered by what I could only interpret as humility. "Olivia," he greeted me with a nod. "Heard about the Gold Coast location. Prime real estate." "Thanks," I replied, accepting the glass of wine my mother offered. "We're excited about the potential for a physical showcase." The conversation remained pleasantly neutral through the first course of dinner, with my parents inquiring about the storefront renovation plans and Michael occasionally contributing a relevant observation about commercial real estate trends. It wasn't until dessert was served that my father cleared his throat and addressed the real purpose of the gathering. "Your mother and I have been doing some estate planning," he began, his tone deliberately casual. "Part of that process involves decisions about Jensen Capital's future." I glanced at Michael, trying to gauge his reaction, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "As you both know," my father continued, "the company has undergone significant restructuring in the past year. What you may not know is that this process has led me to reconsider my own role and the future leadership of the firm." He paused, looking directly at Michael. "Son, you've done remarkable work building certain divisions of Jensen Capital. Your strengths in client relationships and deal structuring are undeniable." Michael nodded, accepting the qualified praise with an equanimity I hadn't expected. "However," my father went on, "recent events have demonstrated that sustainable growth requires more than aggressive expansion. It requires measured analysis, strategic patience, and a willingness to develop true expertise rather than simply deploying capital." He turned to me, and I felt a sudden tension in anticipation of what might come next. "Olivia, what you've built with Reclaimed Threads exemplifies these qualities. You identified a market segment with growth potential, developed genuine expertise that created barriers to competition, and executed a business plan with discipline and strategic clarity." I sat very still, uncertain where this evaluation was leading. "Your mother and I have discussed this at length," my father said, his gaze now encompassing both Michael and me. "We believe the future of Jensen Capital would be best served by shared leadership that leverages both your strengths." The proposal that followed was as unexpected as it was transformative. My father was suggesting that Michael and I become co-presidents of a restructured Jensen Capital, with Michael focusing on client relationships and capital deployment, while I would oversee strategic planning and new market development. Reclaimed Threads would remain separate but could potentially benefit from capital investment and operational support from Jensen Capital if I chose to pursue more aggressive expansion. The silence that followed this proposal was profound. I looked at Michael, expecting to see the familiar competitive resistance, the refusal to share leadership that had characterized our relationship since childhood. Instead, I saw something entirely new, thoughtful consideration, perhaps even relief. "I'd need to understand how this would work in practice," Michael said finally. the operational details, the decision-making protocols. Of course, our father nodded. This would be a carefully structured transition, not an overnight change. And reclaimed threads remain mine, I stated, not as a question, but as a condition. Any relationship between the companies would be at my discretion. Absolutely, my father confirmed. Your business stands on its own merits. This proposal is about Jensen Capital's future, not about absorbing what you've built. The conversation continued late into the evening, exploring potential structures and safeguards that would make such an arrangement workable. What struck me most powerfully throughout the discussion was not the proposal itself, though that was certainly significant, but the way Michael engaged with it. Gone was the dismissive brother who had laughed at my business concept. Gone was the competitive sibling determined to overshadow my achievements. In his place was a thoughtful businessman acknowledging both his strengths and limitations, considering a partnership that would have been unthinkable just 18 months earlier. When I finally left my parents' house that night, Michael walked me to my car. The cool evening air seemed to create a space for candor that the formal setting of the dinner table had not. I owe you an apology, he said simply, surprising me with his directness. For dismissing your business concept, for launching a competing venture without understanding the market, for a lot of things, actually. I studied him in the dim light of the driveway, searching for the hidden agenda or strategic positioning I had come to expect. Finding none, I responded with equal honesty. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot, especially now. He nodded, hands in his pockets, looking more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The vintage fashion venture was a mistake, not because the market wasn't viable, but because I entered it for the wrong reasons. Which were? I prompted, though I already knew the answer. To prove I could do it better than you, he admitted. To maintain the dynamic that's always existed between us. It was childish. The simple acknowledgement of the pattern that had defined our relationship since childhood was more powerful than any apology could have been. Michael wasn't just recognizing a business misjudgment. He was acknowledging the deeper truth of our sibling rivalry and his role in perpetuating it. We should consider Dad's proposal, he continued. Not immediately, but seriously. Your strategic approach complements my client relationships. It could work, professionally speaking. And personally speaking? I asked the question that really mattered hanging between us. That's the harder part, isn't it? He said with a rueful smile. But maybe that's the point. Maybe working together is how we finally move past the competition and become actual siblings. I drove home that night. I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since that fateful dinner, when Michael had laughed at my business concept. What had begun as a personal journey to prove my brother wrong had evolved into something far more meaningful, a successful business built on genuine passion and expertise, a redefined family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than competitive positioning, and most importantly, a new understanding of my own capabilities and worth. The girl who had sought validation through comparison, who had measured her achievements against her brother's expectations, who had defined success in terms of external recognition, she had been replaced by a woman who recognized her own value, who made decisions based on her own judgment, who built a business that reflected her authentic interests and strengths. This transformation wasn't merely professional, it was deeply personal. The skills that had made Reclaimed Threads successful, the careful authentication of value, the recognition of quality beneath surface appearance, the appreciation of historical context and provenance, had become tools for understanding my own worth, independent of family dynamics or competitive frameworks. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed an email notification on my phone from Michael, sent just minutes after our conversation. The subject line read simply, "Thoughts on next steps." I smiled, recognizing the significance of this ordinary business communication. This wasn't Michael attempting to control the narrative or position himself advantageously. It was a colleague sharing ideas, a sibling reaching across a long-established divide. The new equilibrium taking shape between us wasn't about winners and losers, leaders and followers, or any of the other competitive frameworks that had defined our relationship for decades. It was about two distinct individuals with different strengths and approaches finding ways to collaborate rather than compete, to support rather than undermine, to recognize difference without assigning value judgments. 18 months earlier, when I had quit my finance job to launch Reclaimed Threads, success in my mind had been defined by proving Michael wrong, showing him and my parents that my glorified garage sale could become a viable business. Now, success meant something entirely different. Building a company that reflected my values, developing expertise that created genuine value, establishing relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. Michael's email represented more than a business communication. It symbolized the possibility of a relationship rebuilt on healthier foundations. Our shared history couldn't be erased. The patterns established in childhood had shaped both of us in profound ways, but it could be acknowledged, understood, and ultimately transcended. As I entered my home that night, I passed the framed Chicago Magazine cover story about Reclaimed Threads that hung in my entryway. The headline read, "From Finance to Fashion: How Olivia Jensen Built a Vintage Empire." On expertise and authenticity, the journey captured in that headline, from corporate analyst to entrepreneurial curator, from seeking external validation to recognizing internal value, from competing with my brother to defining my own path, was the true story behind Reclaimed Threads. Not just a business success, but a personal transformation that had forever altered how I saw myself, my family, and my place in the world. Michael had laughed when I started my small business. Now he had proposed a partnership between equals. But the most significant change wasn't in his perception of me. It was in my perception of myself. No matter what decision I made about Jensen Capital, about potential collaboration with my brother, about the future direction of Reclaimed Threads, it would be made from a position of confident self-knowledge rather than reactive defensiveness. That transformation, from defining myself in relation to Michael to defining myself on my own terms, was the ultimate victory, far more meaningful than any business success or competitive triumph could ever be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe. And hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.